I'm Mike Govoni, and for the last 15 years, I've been in recovery from addiction and on the deepest quest to find healing, to experience my own unique wholeness beyond the story of what happened to me. By taking an integrative, holistic approach to experience transformation, I bring you the Healing Beyond Recovery podcast, a show dedicated to people in recovery who are looking for deeper healing and transformation. Welcome, everyone, to another episode on the Healing Beyond Recovery podcast. I'm excited to bring this episode to you today with Ryan Hampton. I think if anyone is an icon in recovery, it's for sure Ryan in the amazing advocacy work he does within the addiction recovery community. When we were recording this episode just last week, I was remembering my work as an advocate and recovery coach supporting 3 major hospitals in the Boston area for patients who had just overdosed and are suffering from other substance abuse related issues. And it was very heavy. It was a heavy time to be in that environment, but it was also a very rewarding time. The stories I would hear from the person and people who were struggling were very touching and really allowed me to see them as another person just looking to be happy, right? They were here in this environment, and many of them just overdosed an hour or two before I saw them. So some of them with the look of fresh death in their eyes, right? I'd be sitting across from them and they'd be sharing their story with me and their pain. And it was heavy at times, but it was really a rewarding job. And I'm really happy I got that experience. But I say this because the advocacy work and being on the front lines like that, like Ryan is most of the time, is really can be really challenging, can be really difficult. And I think it's very important to have practices for ourselves to be able to discharge that energy, right? Often I would come back and I would have to sage myself to literally get this energy off of me. So if you spent time in the ICU or the emergency room, then you know exactly what I mean. And to be in there day after day is very heavy. But once again, coming back to supporting the recovery community is very rewarding, and it was a great opportunity. So on a lighter note, today we get the pleasure of spending some time with Ryan. And Ryan went from White House to homeless and addicted to heroin. Ryan shares his personal story and the work he does on the front lines, advocating for policy change to support people and their families who are struggling with addiction and to make the opioid crisis a thing of the past. Ryan is 5 years into recovery from a decade-long opioid addiction and has been rocketed to the center of Americans' rising addiction recovery advocacy movement. A former White House staffer under the Clinton administration, he has worked with multiple nonprofits and national recovery advocacy campaigns. He is now a prominent leading face and voice of addiction recovery and is changing the national conversation about addiction. With content that reaches over 1 million people a week, Ryan is breaking down cultural barriers that have kept people suffering in silence and is inspiring a new generation of people recovering out loud through his Voices project. He's also advocating for solutions and holding public policymakers accountable. That'd be a great thing, huh? Awesome. I'm happy for that. He was part of a core team that released the first ever U.S. Surgeon General's report on addiction in 2016 and was singled out by Forbes as a top social entrepreneur in the recovery movement. Ryan connects a vast network of people who are passionate about ending the drug epidemic in America. He has been featured by and is a contributor to media outlets such as the USA Today, MSNBC, Fox and Friends, the New York Times, HuffPost, The Hill, the Wall Street Journal, and more. Well, that's a nice list of accolades for you. And without further ado, Ryan, welcome to the show. Ryan, I just want to say thank you for taking a moment to be on the show. And I know you're a busy guy and you have a lot to do, but thank you for taking the time to share your story and your work with the world and with the listeners today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And one thing that really intrigued me is just your courage. Your story and who you are has courage all over it. And I think that's something that I have as well, and I admire that in you. So I just want to recognize that, and particularly your journey from going from 19 years old and starting out your first job at the White House to becoming addicted to opiates on the streets of LA. And I just was wondering if you could just share a little bit about that journey with us so the listeners can get a feel for you and what you've been through and how that was the catalyst to your work and who you are today.
Sure. I don't think my story is maybe aside from, having a stint at the White House when I was in college is that unique. But um, I, I had, I was kind of an up and comer. I had a career in front of me. I, did well in school. I, followed all the rules. I, ran for class president. I was involved in a lot of activities and always particularly interested in politics. And I know people ask, when after they've read American Fix, they'll ask me, was there any type of like adverse childhood trauma or things that happened in your childhood that maybe could have contributed to your substance use disorder? And the answer to that question is always, yes, of course. I grew up in a broken home. I was, hiding my identity as a gay man. I was, confused about who I was. I had a father who was in federal prison, for while I was in high school. We didn't have a good relationship. There were definitely indicators, but I also drank. I had my first drink when I was in high school. I experimented with drugs. I went on to college and, I partied like any of my other classmates. The only difference was that I was the one who, 6 years ago found myself homeless on the streets of, Los Angeles on Hollywood and Highland begging for help and not having anywhere to go. And, to go back to your question about the White House, I was interested in politics and I had applied, coming out of high school for an internship in the White House and ended up getting that internship and was always interested in policy and campaigns and, government work. And the internship turned into a small job, a junior level assistant job at the White House towards the tail end of the Clinton administration. And after President Clinton had left office, I stayed in Washington, D.C. and took a job with the Democratic National Committee and worked on a governor's campaign in Florida and worked for a member of Congress in Florida. And, this was in 2000, sometime between 2001, 2003. And in 2003, I was still living I was back in D.C. working on another kind of campaign work around organizing and fundraising for the Democratic Party. And I had gone on a hiking trip with my roommate, and I slipped and I fell on the steep hill on the Billy Goat Trail, and which is in between Virginia and Maryland, and injured my ankle and injured my knee, and ended up in the care of an urgent care physician who prescribed me high grade opioids for the first time, and told me at that injury that I would need to get that knee and get that ankle checked out and get an MRI. And, I don't think much of a shocker to anybody who's read the book, but I didn't get that knee and that ankle checked out. But what I did do was I kept going back and getting another prescription and another prescription. And, suddenly I started to find a solution in kind of a lot of the identity crisis issues that I was going through at the time. And the real nexus of that story was shortly after that injury, my father had actually passed away that year. Within that year, I moved back to Florida, South Florida, right on the Broward County, Miami-Dade County line. And, was getting these prescriptions for opioids. And I got back to Florida and saw my primary care physician. And I was like, I'm on this medication. And I never thought there was anything wrong with it. Right. I mean, I was getting a prescription, probably a little bit too much. I was taking it. Did it make me feel good? Yes. Did it make me what I thought overperform? Yes. Did it take away the pain? Yes, it did. It like checked all the boxes on so many things. Did it handle my depression? Yes. Like all this stuff. And went to see my primary care, and he was like, look, these medications you're on, which at that point, had turned into, it was oxycodone and Oxycontin and, all this different stuff. And he's like, I can't write this, but you can go to a, there's registered pain clinics that deal in, there's specialty pain clinics, and they can, they can take care of you. I said, okay, great. And I just looked for a pain clinic, pulled out the Miami New Times, and there was advertisements for them all over the place. And there were pain clinics, it felt like, on every corner in South Florida. And ended up, getting an appointment in one. And that was, at the time, I didn't know it, but that was my fall into kind of the South Florida pill mill culture. And I fell really, really hard. Over the course of several years, it went from medication to, using as prescribed, to using when I wanted to overusing, to, running out of my prescriptions early and not being able to get them from the same doctor, to starting doctor shopping because I had to maintain, a certain level of wellness, I guess you could say, because I would get sick if I didn't have a certain amount of medication. And in about 2009, the state of Florida had decided they were going to institute their first version of the PDMP, what's now the PDMP, the drug monitoring database. That wasn't really that well set up. That, for, as with anything new, it wasn't really that great when it first came out. And it was essentially used to punish people who were misusing their prescriptions, to protect the providers and the doctors, not necessarily the patients. And I showed up to one of my doctor's appointments, and they pulled out a list, and they said, you're in this database and you're seeing all these doctors. And, I'll say kindly, the way, they basically kicked me out. But what happened was I was called a junkie and a drug seeker, and told if I showed up to that clinic again, I'd be, tagged for trespassing. And I mean, the doctor knew everything that was going on, had known for some time. But now that I was kind of this, I had a scarlet letter because I was in this database, she wanted nothing to do with me. And it was that day that I, started using heroin. I didn't have a choice. Like, the thought of choice or doing the right thing, or, all the series of yets had disappeared at that point. I needed to be well. I needed to not be in withdrawal. And I had to use no matter what. And that's when heroin use started for me, and, became IV heroin use shortly after that. And all the things that come with it, right? Homelessness, not being able to be employed, no health insurance, no apartment, isolation from friends and family, overdoses, all of it. It was a nightmare. And nobody wanted anything to do with me, and I had attempted a few times treatment, not on my own accord, but because I was just kind of like mandated there by, friends or family, or, was dealing with some sort of circumstance where I had to go to treatment and I didn't have a choice. And treatment never really stuck for me. I was never offered anything like buprenorphine or medication. And I didn't even know that type of stuff existed until later on in my journey. But, a very long story short, I eventually made my way out to California for what I thought would be a new job. Thought that, changing geography, moving from Florida to California would be great, and I could fix everything that way. But I only ended up in a deeper hole, and which led me to the streets. And on Thanksgiving Eve 2014, after trying to get help at this point for quite some time, and with the grace of a higher power in my recovery journey, but as importantly, access to Medicaid, I was able to get treatment. And my recovery date is February 2nd, 2015, and I'll celebrate 6 years in February.
Wow. Congratulations, Ryan. That's amazing. And when I say courage, there's so many points to your story that I'm talking about. One in particular is coming out as not as someone just in recovery, but a gay man in recovery. And I think that's beautiful and courageous that you did that. And I just want to say thank you. And I too suffered from identity issues when I was younger because my dad was gay, and I discovered that, and I didn't know, and that I was always questioning myself and that sort of stuff, and I had my own adverse childhood experiences, and I just think it's really courageous for you to really come out and allow the world to see you for fully who you are, and I think that's beautiful. And I know you mentioned at one point in your using that you lost a friend or many friends, but one in particular, Greg, to an overdose. And you said that with policymakers, newspapers, and others alike not really listening, you felt like you had to do something. Can you just tell us about the time where you, maybe you were sober at this point and you just really felt like you had to take your background in education and desire for politics to make a big change?
I so it was I was about a year into recovery, and I was living at a recovery residence in Pasadena, California, and um, while I was out there using, I could maybe count on my hand, a couple people I remember who died, people I'd used with, and I certainly wasn't very close to them. Um, in my first year, though, in that recovery house, sober, you know, I in about 6 months, I started losing a lot of friends, roommates of mine, people that I got close to, people I'd gone to treatment with. Being turned away at hospital rooms after having a recurrence of use, or what is also known as a relapse, being kicked out of the house, for small infractions, and going back out on the streets and using and getting high and dying, overdosing, being turned away for health insurance,
Mm,
because they had a substance use disorder, um, and dying, right,
mm,
and dying, and I was close to them. I loved them. They were part of my community, and I it was four in the first year, and then it was 12, 16 months in, and it turned into 24 within 2 years, and it just kept happening. And in that first year, I remember I was it was an election year in 2016, and the presidential election was going on, and people were running for office. And when the house manager came in to tell me that one of my friends, Nick, had died,
mm,
and the circumstances of his death, and he had gone to the hospital the night before, and he was turned away, and he was found on the sidewalk the next morning dead after
mm,
being turned away from the hospital. Um, he had told us in a way that was like, this is just what happens. He was like, this is what happens when you get into recovery. People die. And that cliche that they say, when you get into, when you get sober, get a nice suit because you're going to go to a lot of funerals. And he was telling us this as if this is just like the new norm, that we needed to accept it. And I remember sitting there being like, no, this is not normal. Like, I know people die from overdoses, but like, the circumstances
yeah.
are maddening.
Mm,
Like, people being turned away for help, like that, like the system's failing. Like, and we're letting, these systems get away with murder, essentially. And I had to do something. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea. But I told my story in an op-ed called "Why I Started Facing Addiction Out Loud," where I detailed the tragic deaths of a few friends of mine, and in my own story, in the Huffington Post that May of 2016. And it was pretty well received, and it was terrifying at the same time, because I was outing myself, and I didn't know what the impact would be.
mm,
But people had reached out to me that I hadn't talked to in years, colleagues, family members, friends, people who were in the same boat as I was, and wanting to know how they could get more involved. And I didn't know what to do. So that summer 2016, I went on a road trip with my best friend across the country, and we traveled for 30 days to 22 states, across 22 states, 8,000 miles in 30 days, and stayed in homes of people who were in recovery or had died, families who had lost loved ones to an
wow.
overdose. We went into jails, we went to recovery centers, we went to nonprofits, we
Mm,
went and talked to policymakers and communities just to learn. Like, I wanted to learn. And I wanted people to be heard as well, because I certainly didn't know what to do, but maybe they did, and documented it all on a YouTube series that I did called Facing Addiction Across America. And it's on YouTube. And that was like my first dive into advocacy. And I came home from that trip that summer just feeling like, what's next? What can we do more? And that's when I started, working with policymakers. That's when we founded the Voices Project, which is our nonprofit. That's when, we started looking to legislators and how we can, get specific laws passed in states that protect people in recovery homes, that expand access to treatment, that expand access to naloxone, that starts to look at things other than just treatment. We know that, one of the things that's most frustrating to me is when all the funding comes down, it goes in, they say treatment and recovery, but it really just goes into treatment, and treatment's not recovery, right? The United States Surgeon General's report from 2016 from our incoming surgeon, he's going to get a second whack at the job, and he's phenomenal. Dr. Vivek Murthy, wrote that first Surgeon General's report in 2016, and in it cited that, if you can get a person to 5 years, beyond 5 years of sustained recovery, they've got an 85% chance at maintaining that recovery, sustaining that recovery for the rest of their life. Yet all of the funding and the infrastructure that we have set up in this country is to still deal with this as an acute crisis, right? Like, get someone treatment, get them back out into society, and they'll be fine. No, that's not how it works. You can get someone to treatment and get them stabilized, but much like any other chronic illness, you need to maintain that stabilization. And how you do that with a substance use disorder is you make sure that people have access to housing, qualified, safe, stable housing. They have access to healthcare. They've got job training opportunities and employment opportunities, that they're able to eat. I mean, simple things like that. I mean, that they've got access to recovery support services, whether it be a peer recovery coach or, some sort of counseling. I mean, there's a whole list of things we need to be doing in those first several years of recovery. And so, my focus, and, particularly in the last couple of years, has been, how do we build that recovery capital infrastructure? And how do we get it funded, right? Because if someone, has cancer, you don't just, have them see one specific doctor and put them on one specific medication and then never follow up with them again, right? I mean, and that's essentially what we do with addiction is, we treat them one specific way, and as soon as they're out of treatment, it's like, good luck. Don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Ryan, have you heard of the programs that they were rolling out? I was involved in one of them in Boston when I was actually going into emergency rooms for the opiate epidemic specifically, but I would deal with other acute situations, alcohol, cocaine, things of that nature. And I acted as a recovery coach to support people who came in the emergency room and wanted, or basically I was an advocate for them. So I would try to find them, detoxes and, stable living and halfway houses, things of that nature. But we lost funding. I mean, what can we do to, like you said, build that capital up for these programs?
So the Boston model is fascinating. It's actually a really good one. Former ONDCP director Michael Botticelli was highly involved in some of the design of that. I know out of Mass, I think Mass General. But the Boston program is great because it really looks at the full continuum. And sadly, we have seen programs like that get defunded,
yes,
or just completely the carpet pulled out from under them. And this is why, people like you, people like me, people who can speak out, and who have made a conscious decision to do that, need to speak out and speak out loudly. The math is on our side. There's 23 million people in this country that live in long-term recovery. There's another 22 or 23 million or so currently suffering. That's about 45 million Americans. It's, do the math. It's roughly 1 in 3 American households crosses the spectrum in terms of class, race, sexual identity, gender, it's just it touches every facet of this nation, and it certainly has a huge impact on our economy. The problem is that we don't have many people out front, or enough people out front, calling for the change that we need on a policy level. So policymakers have gotten away with doing the bare minimum in addressing this public health crisis. And we are seeing the outcomes of that now. We're certainly going to see and we're seeing it, a devastating increase in overdose and suicide deaths coming out of COVID.
Yeah, what if the numbers are like 60 or 70,000, I think.
Yeah, it's going to be worse. I mean, in terms of percentage, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw in certain pockets of the country 200 plus percentage increases in overdose and suicide deaths.
Wow.
And we don't have an infrastructure to deal with it, to hold it to capacity. But we look at COVID, which, not to take away, because it is a public health crisis also. We have a dueling public health crisis, but we see the response to COVID, right? We see a marshaling of federal and state resources, which is completely adequate and appropriate. But when it comes to substance use disorder, we don't see anywhere near that. I mean, we call it a public health crisis, but we don't fund it like a public health crisis. So how do you turn that around? More people need to get engaged. More people need to be asking their members of Congress and their state legislators, why is it that we don't have infrastructure to deal with this? And what do we need to do to change that? And when people have spoken up and have spoken out and have built those coalitions, we've seen some promising impact, right? We've seen legislation move forward. We've seen, we saw CARA, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery bill, back in 2016 pass, and we're looking at a CARA 2.0, next year in the next Congress. We've seen states start to, pick up the pieces where they've completely failed our communities. So it really takes a vocal, engaged, and active constituency of consequence, because politicians respond to that. They don't necessarily respond to a community that may be harmed, but a community that's silent.
Yes, and I know in your book you talk about, you have an outline in American Fix. You outline the challenges the recovery movement is facing, and a concrete plan of action towards making America's addiction crisis a thing of the past. What haven't we covered today, or what can we just touch upon today, maybe from your book, that we can begin to change things? And maybe if there's something you can say to the listeners right now to go talk to your public official, or just any small piece of information that can potentially make a big result down the line, what can we share with them?
I would say, so that American Fix was published in 2018, and that agenda feels like it's changing by the day, right? The science changes, the innovation changes, the politicians change, things are just constantly changing. It's a framework, though, for what we could be doing. But if I had to pick one thing to ask people to do, and it's a highly personal decision, and it took me time to come to, but it was the best decision I ever made. And it was the single decision that's led me to be able to do the work that I am so passionate about now, is to be open about your experience and your own recovery journey. To be open and to be proud of it, and to embrace it as a part of your identity. To not feel like you have to hide it.
So more or less share your story?
Share your story, but embrace your story, right? And not to be ashamed of it.
And there's the courage, Ryan. You're a courageous dude.
But it's also a very personal decision, because, a lot of what we advocate for today, look, privacy protections for people who have a substance use disorder or who are in recovery are on ice.
Mm.
People can still lose their jobs. They can lose their housing. They can be denied health. I mean, they can be denied life insurance. They can, we still criminalize a lot of this. I mean, there are real outcomes and real consequences for many people for sharing their stories, which makes it more important, though, if you're listening, for those who can do it, to do it for those who still can't,
Mm.
right? And to be their voice and to bring their experience with you. And that, once you're able to do that, if you're able to, because it is a very personal decision and it takes an extraordinary amount of examination before you make that decision, if it's the right decision for you. But if you do that, everything else kind of flows from that decision, because it's very hard to go out and be authentic and advocate if you're still kind of having to live in this cone of silence, because there's only so much you can say.
Mm.
Right. And so and stigma and shame, and people
Mm.
call it stigma. I take it a step further. It's systemic discrimination and prejudice. That's really what stigma is. Um, you know, we have to combat that before we can combat anything else. So that's kind of like the big first step, right? To being able to take on these next agenda items. Now, certainly you could do it without sharing your story, and many people do. Um, but one of the most moving and effective ways to create change is by having an effective public narrative. And the public narrative comes from your values. It comes from your lived experience. It comes from
Mm.
your journey.
For sure, 100%, Ryan. I totally agree with you. And it took a lot of courage for me to share my own personal story. But once I did, it was almost like people, saw that and they were drawn to it and they would ask me. And then it allowed me to, stand up and do the work I do today. So I really appreciate you sharing that. In fact, as I opened this talk with you, that's one of the things that really caught my eye was you were really a proponent about sharing your story, which I think can make a huge difference. And I know we're doing a short episode, and I want to be mindful of your time today. And I just want to talk a little bit about the actual situation we're in right now with COVID. And I just want to ask you, how are you doing? And maybe what are you doing right now in this time of a pandemic to support your own recovery? And what does that look like? Maybe if you had to share a couple insights or tips on what's working for you right now in the shutdowns and lockdowns and what's the struggle that's going on.
It has been COVID-19. And I mean, my fiance had COVID. My best friend had COVID. My mother hasn't been out of her house in 9 months. I
Mm.
mean, I've, or fielding phone calls left and right of people who are needing help. And sadly, some of them, passing away are no longer with us. And it has been personally, recovery wise, professionally, all around 360, probably the most challenging time I've dealt with in my recovery
Mm.
since it's in the last 6 years. Um, I don't know if I had been in that first year, if this is something I could have gotten through. I can't, I can't speculate because that's just not my reality. I'm a little bit further along, but I often think about it. Not having access to recovery meetings, being, being stuck at home, certainly not having access to internet because I didn't have internet. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have a smartphone
Mm-hmm.
after early recovery, so I don't know about, online virtual meetings, and I don't know what it would have been like. I can tell you though, I've stayed close to my program. I've stayed very connected to peers of mine. And I think as important to that has been being of service has been a
Yeah.
very big piece of getting through this for me, which has been, when the shutdowns first happened in the spring, we were out delivering food to recovery homes and getting food donations. And, I'd take just about anybody's phone call, whether I know them or not, and have a conversation, or, providing support and helping organize phone meetings. And it's just been, and also staying grateful. I mean, the gratitude lists have been pretty constant throughout this for me. But I'd say connectivity and service have been key.
Yeah.
And, I believe we're at the tail end of it, and I try to remain optimistic even with how dark it is. But I got to hang on to that optimism, because I just can't get into a full negative mindset. It destroys me when I do.
Yeah, for sure. The connectivity and being of service is huge right now, especially for myself. I feel the same. Even if it's on Zoom or it's on the computer, it's still helpful. Reaching out to others that may be suffering more than you are and giving them a pick me up. I mean, this is how it works. And I appreciate you being on the front lines there and doing what you're doing. And before we end the call here, Ryan, maybe you can just tell the audience a little bit about where they can learn more about you, about American Fix, and maybe where they could find you on social media. And I believe you have a you have a text line that you use too, because I get your texts.
Sure. Yeah. Anybody could find me at ryanhampton.com. On Twitter at Ryan for Recovery. On Instagram at Ryan J. Hampton. You could find me on Facebook, and anybody can shoot me a text too, just to connect or learn more. It's through my community number, and that text number is 702-745-7816. I'll put a disclaimer: I'm not a treatment provider, and I don't provide treatment services or referrals or anything like that. So I'm not really a great resource for that stuff. There's a lot of people who do that in the federal government, and SAMHSA provides those services. But if you're interested in advocacy and getting involved in story, sharing and impact, feel free to hit me up. And Mike, thanks so much for having me on. I look forward to seeing you do big things in 2021, and we will certainly be following.
For sure, Ryan. Yes, thank you for who you are, who you've become. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. And thank you for being on the show today, Ryan.
Thank you.
Be well. Thank you for listening to another episode on the Healing Beyond Recovery podcast. If you like today's episode, I ask you for a simple favor, and please share this episode with a friend. It's really helpful to get the word out, because so many people out there are suffering, and people need to know that recovery is possible and hear the message of hope. I also want to offer you the opportunity to subscribe to my email list, where you will be the first to receive notices about upcoming shows. As well, you will receive my free holistic recovery guide on how to lose weight, have thriving relationships, feel good in your body, all while staying sober. You can receive your free guide today by clicking the free guide link in the show notes, or by visiting my webpage at www.mikegovoni.com. That's MikeGovoni. Once again, thanks for listening, and remember, you can heal no matter what your story may be.